It's always the Republicans or their sympathizers who say you can't have paid leave, you can't provide health care. They don't mind having big government to interfere with a woman's right to choose and to try to take down Planned Parenthood. They're fine with big government when it comes to that. I'm sick of it.
Welcome back to News Talk and our look at the first Democratic presidential debate. I'm Bruce DuPuy. Great to have you there. Great to have here our special panel. Steve Shepard is campaigns and elections editor for Politico. Alejandro Negron is host of Agenda on News Channel 8 and our partners Telemundo. David Mark is an author, political analyst, former editor for Politico. Lots for us to still discuss in no particular order. I thought Anderson Cooper did a fantastic job, really well prepared, tough questions, didn't make himself the show. He let it be, I thought, on the candidates and the substance. What was your takeaway on his job in a high-pressure moment?
Yeah, I agree with all that. He really went after each of the 5 candidates and kind of tried to get at their vulnerabilities without being demeaning. I thought in the first debate, that last Republican debate with 11 candidates on stage, it was tougher to do that sort of thing. He was more trying to play them off against each other. I thought the questions to Bernie Sanders were particularly incisive, saying essentially, look, you're a self-proclaimed socialist, you honeymooned in the Soviet Union, you supported the Sandinistas in Nicaragua in the 1980s, etc. How do you think that's really going to play in the general election? I thought that was a very well articulated version of that question.
Although to me, left unsaid is the obvious follow-up. And of course, let's stipulate, you can't ask everything. There just isn't enough time. But if you're not willing to join the Democratic Party, how can you ask people who are Democrats to be the highest Democrat there is, the presidential nominee, the nominee that, the person that you think should be in the White House? To me, that's still an open question for him.
Absolutely, and I think, like you said, you can't ask every question, but I think Anderson Cooper did a great job. Not only Anderson Cooper, but the rest of the folks from CNN that were asking questions. They were all tough, and they were willing to confront and call them out on whatever they weren't being totally forthcoming with.
As you listen to Lincoln Chafee, Martin O'Malley, and Jim Webb, Webb, the former senator from Virginia, O'Malley, the former governor of Maryland, mayor of Baltimore, what thoughts did you have listening to these 3 guys desperate for a moment, desperate for a breakout opportunity to really move them from single digits into the mix?
Well, they're not just at single digits. They're at 0, 1, and 2%. They are barely registering, and they didn't really register last night either. Even though Martin O'Malley in some ways seemed like the most polished politician on the stage, which, given the impression he needed to make, I don't think was helpful for him.
Is it possible that he'll get more of a bump than the pundits on this day after seem to be expecting? Because a lot of the commentary has been just sort of dismissive, but I thought he had a few moments. Maybe not the breakout home run, but could he have hit a single or a double that may be reflected in future polling?
It's possible. Look, after the first Republican debate, I would have told you this is going to be the beginning of the end for Donald Trump, and I may have even said this on your show, and it wasn't. So it's difficult. We have focus groups, we have polls that have come out right after, we have our own analysis watching these debates, and sometimes what voters see at home is different from what we see.
I've found myself trying to think ahead to the second. What, they're going to be 6 now. They're scheduled to have 6, right? And Martin O'Malley clearly wants more. He took on Debbie Wasserman Schultz from the stage while she was sitting right there in the front row in front of a national television audience of who knows how many millions of people. The ratings here in Washington were huge. I have no idea what it was like, what the numbers were around the country, but very, very high and sustained across the 2.5 hours, 2 hours, whatever it was. The numbers were there. People were really plugged in. But I was trying to think, what are these future debates going to look like? Chafee, how does he stay in the race? Webb, I can't imagine it. I mean, is this contest going to shrink?
Well, those 2 candidates you just mentioned, Chafee and Webb, may not be invited to the next round of debates. It's up to each of these individual network sponsors who they want in. The threshold for this one last night was just 1%. And as Steve said, those guys were rounded down. They're at like 0.2, 0.3%. It's not entirely clear it will even be a 5-person debate stage next time. It could be plausibly Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, because the sponsors could say you don't just need 1%, you now need 5%, because we're closer to the Iowa caucuses, New Hampshire primary, et cetera. In other words, the stakes are higher.
Talk about how the evening as a whole and I want all three of you, Alejandro first, to weigh in on this. Talk, if you would, about how the evening as a whole contrasted with the Republican debates that came before, in terms of tone, in terms of the issues, in terms of the interplay. It struck me as we were seeing a very different, not to say better, worse, but dramatically different. I don't think you could escape that takeaway. Fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. Maybe it wasn't as entertaining as watching Donald Trump go after his opponents on stage, but I thought that the folks who watched it learned a lot about these candidates, learned a lot about the Democratic Party's positions on key issues important to that, to folks who vote Democratic. So in that sense, I thought it was very informative, which is precisely what a debate like this should be. Contrast that with the Republican Party, name calling and arguing amongst each other.
Stephen, David?
Mechanically, a 5-person debate is going to be a lot different from an 11-person debate, and I think we saw that last night. The other thing I would say is, yes, Donald Trump is, a bombastic figure who's going to insult people, and the networks want him to because more people will watch. But the reality is that both parties are being pulled toward the edges. Bernie Sanders and Jim Webb were both elected to the Senate first time in 2006. Same year, Democrats took over the Senate because they had candidates like Jim Webb in states like Virginia. Look at the other 4 candidates. They agree much more with Bernie Sanders or the other 3 candidates much more with Bernie Sanders than they do with Jim Webb. The Democratic Party looks more like Bernie Sanders than it looks like Jim Webb, just as the Republican Party looks more like Donald Trump and Ben Carson and Ted Cruz than it looks like John Kasich and Chris Christie.
One thing I want to add, the difference also is this lack of diversity on the Democratic Party. You see a lot of color in the Republican field and not as much in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I would just add debate prep matters. Hillary Clinton did her homework and then some. She's always been known as a diligent student. You might agree with her or not on the issues, but she comes prepared. She's a former corporate lawyer of sorts back in Arkansas. She always was very studious. The other guys didn't really seem to have a game plan. I think Lincoln Chafee was hoping his kind of aw shucks personality may endear himself to voters, but he just didn't really come across so strongly. So I think whoever is on the debate stage with her next time around better bring their A game.
We're a week out from Hillary Clinton's testimony before the Benghazi committee. That's an unknown. We don't know how that'll fully play out. Setting that to the side for the moment because it's an unknowable, is it possible that Joe Biden's moment is slipping away or has slipped away?
Yes, certainly. And he has... Basically, he would have to transition. He has about 2 weeks before some of these key filing deadlines in some of these big states start creeping up on him. He has to decide now whether he is going to be in, out, or an emergency, in case of emergency, break glass only option.
Alejandro Negron, David Marks, Steve Shepard, great conversation. Thank you all very much for being here on this day after. We'll step aside for just a moment. We are back, though, with much more News Talk right after this.
I'm fine.
Mike, what do you think? Pillow or no?